thank you everyone for coming tonight. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tongariro tōku maunga, ko te arawa tōku waka, ko tūwharetoa tōku iwi, e noho ana aho, e te taha o te awa o Waikato, ko April tōku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is April Jolliffe-Simpson. I hope you can all hear me well enough. I whakapapa back to Turangi, which is south of Taupo. I grew up in South Auckland and I moved to Waikato for university and I loved it so much I haven't left since. Thank you for providing a little bit about my background. I'm a lecturer. I teach forensic psychology and crime science at the university. But today I'm here to talk to you about responding to family violence. I'd like to provide a little bit of background and an overview of what things look like at the moment. Talk about, how well the things we do now are working, and then think a little bit about what we should be doing next to improve on what we're doing currently. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I probably don't need to convince you that family violence is an important problem in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think you're probably here because you already think that. Am I right? Yeah, and you would be right. So family violence is an important issue. It's something that many of us will have experienced or know someone who has experienced or at least heard of. But when we think about family violence, we're not often thinking about the entire picture of the problem. And what I mean is when we talk about family violence, we're often thinking of domestic abuse or intimate partner relationships and harm that happens within that context. And that is absolutely important, and it's crucial that we do a better job of understanding and responding to that problem. But another part of the problem is, of course, tamariki, our children who are in those situations. But also, children themselves can be aggressors of family violence. Young people can harm their parents, people can harm grandparents, and we also see harm happening between siblings. And importantly, when we see one type of family violence, more often than not, there's also other types of family violence going on. And taken together, what these things mean is that really it's a much more complex problem than how it's often represented, studied, understood, and importantly, responded to. The other thing about family violence is that when we use the word violence, we're thinking about physical harm, aren't we? We're thinking about something like this image here where there's a person assaulting the other person. That's what comes to mind. And again, that's important. But family violence is also the chronic, or even not chronic, just that emotional or psychological harm that happens that can really accumulate over time. And often when you speak to people who've experienced family violence, it's these forms of harm that have the greatest and often most long-lasting impact. Can also include behaviours like threats or intimidating behaviours, as well as damaging someone else's property or harming their pets or otherwise controlling them through financial means or other means. So I hope that what I've gotten across to you is that the picture is much more broad and complicated, harmful and, difficult than how it's often portrayed. So often people will ask, well, how big is this problem? We like to look at statistics. And I'm going to share some with you just because it's nice to set the scene, but I think they'll also illustrate some of those things that I've just talked to you about in terms of how difficult it is to understand this problem. So a recent survey in 2019 of women in Aotearoa found that 29.1% of women reported experiencing physical intimate partner violence in their lifetime. So that's around a third of women in this survey said, yes, I've experienced this physical form of intimate partner violence. 33.2% of women reported experiencing 2 or more acts of psychological abuse. So that's things like emotional abuse or name-calling. And these things don't necessarily overlap. So the proportion of women experiencing this is quite considerable. Furthermore, 13.4% of women reported experiencing 2 or more acts of controlling behaviour. So this is a bit different to psychological abuse because controlling behaviour is more to do with exerting power or limiting someone's freedom. So that might be like, controlling their access to finances or not paying your fair share or showing up at their work or making it difficult to get work, not allowing them to see friends and family, those kinds of behaviours. So it's not psychological abuse necessarily, although they overlap. It's more restricting that person's freedom. And of course, this is incredibly harmful and something that we want to be responding to. But what this also illustrates is depending on what type of harm you're looking at, you get really different estimates of how much is occurring in our communities. Okay, what about tamariki? So a recent report released by some researchers from Auckland found that almost a quarter of children in New Zealand had been reported for child maltreatment that they looked at, with I think about 9% being substantiated. 3.1% of children experience placements out of the home, so being taken into care. And if you look just at our Māori tamariki, that proportion that had reportedly experienced child maltreatment was 42.2% of the people that they studied. So you can see it's quite a large problem. But again, we have this splintering where we're looking at parts of the problem separately. We're looking at what are the experiences of women in intimate relationships? What are the experiences of children? But I think I don't need to convince you that families don't exist of just children or just women or just one person. Families are entire units. So it is important that we're looking at the whole unit. And the statistics we have at the moment don't really allow us to do that, or don't allow us to do that very well. So it's quite hard to understand how these overlap. And from the perspective of a practitioner, thinking about how to keep families safe, I think that's really important because I think it limits the ability of the studies we're doing to really inform the practices they use because they're not necessarily capturing that really complex picture. So if I try to find some statistics that take that view, they're not so detailed, but I can tell you that New Zealand Police recorded 175,573 family harm investigations in the year to June 2022. So family harm investigations are what they record when there's any type of incident reported where the purported aggressor and victim had any kind of family relationship. Importantly, people have to actually report this for it to be recorded, but it doesn't necessarily need to contain what we would call a crime. So this is kind of, something like an argument over a phone charger could qualify right up through to really, really serious harm occurring. So this hopefully gives us more of an understanding of the picture. And I can tell you also that our frontline police are spending more than 40% of their time responding to family violence. So there are a massive, massive quantity of events. There were also 67,000 reports of concern made to Oranga Tamariki in the year to September 2022, and those are about 50,000 different children. So you can see there's a lot going on. The next one might shock you. I've just told you about the numbers and the volume, but 77% of offences by family members were not reported to police in the last New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey. So if we look at the official statistics, which paint this picture of huge volume, and then we look at the victim surveys, which ask people, okay, what's actually happened to you? Did you report it or not? And 3/4 of it's not being reported, and we still have this massive volume. We can see that this is a really sizable problem. It's a complex problem. It's also a sizable problem. And what we're doing at the moment isn't actually reaching everyone in the community because of this vast underreporting. So last one. With all of that said, with this massive volume, we also know that between 2009 and 2015, there were 194 family violence-related deaths in Aotearoa. Around half of those due to intimate partner violence, but around half weren't. So massive, massive volume, and yet there's this small group of homicides that we desperately want to prevent, right? So if you think in the shoes of a family violence practitioner, what a task. We have all these people experiencing all of this harm. We know that some people are dying. How on earth do we protect them better? So that little prelude, that's my motivation. That's the context we're working in, and that's what we want to do a better job of. How do we find the 194 and intervene with them before it's too late? So I like to use this image because this is what the task feels like to me. How do we predict these things? Human beings are inherently unpredictable. And while it feels weird with these cases to just speculate about the future in that way, we kind of have to. Because when you have such a volume of cases and limited resources, you have to try and allocate those as best you can. You have to try and identify the people at most need, and you have to try and keep them safe, right? But it does feel a little bit like crystal ball gazing. And that kind of is what it was before researchers got involved and tried to help and make it work a bit better. So thinking in the shoes of a family violence practitioner, you've got your case. You're thinking, okay, I have these family members, they have these characteristics, these things are risky. How do I combine that information to make an educated guess about how safe they are in the future and what they might need in order to be safe in the future? So we use this practice called risk assessment. And that's basically what it is researchers will find a collection of factors that are associated with some outcome in the future, some criminal outcome. So in the case of family violence, we might be interested in predicting something like an offence within a specified time frame. So we might want to know, okay, in the next 2 years, will this person be arrested for an offence? Or, I prefer, will there be another call for police service within a certain amount of time, which is the lower threshold, and it can include those non-physical forms of harm. Whatever the outcome is that you choose, you try and find which pieces of information are associated with that outcome if we measure it. So if we measure this thing at time 1, will that improve our ability to know the likelihood of this other thing at time 2? That's essentially the goal. And those factors are put into an instrument. So it'll look like a shopping list. Be like, are these things present? And they'll be combined in some way. So it might be a sum of the items. They might have different weightings according to how important they are. So in some instruments, things like non-fatal strangulation have a much higher weighting because they're thought of as indicators of imminent lethality. And so if that thing is present, they place more weighting on it compared with something else. So each instrument has its own way of combining things. And then what comes out often is a risk level, low, medium, and high, that practitioners then use to guide how they respond to that case. So low-risk cases might receive a phone call, offers for support, maybe encouragement to keep reporting in the future, say. Moderate risk cases might receive maybe a whānau support worker or, different things depending on what their needs are. And the high-risk cases receive really intensive support because those are the situations where the onus for safety moves from the people involved to organisations for keeping those people safe. So that's a really small proportion of cases. What we end up with often is a big lot of people in medium and a very small number of people in high, and we'll talk about that later. So, turning now to my research. I've given you a lot of background. I've talked about the problem, and I've talked about the idea of risk assessment. And I guess I just want to note that risk assessment isn't the solution to all of this. There's a lot of criticisms of risk assessment, many of which I agree with. But in the absence of a silver bullet, it's something to try and improve our decision making. That's why we want to be critical of it and think about how we could do it better. So in my research, that's what I've done. I've looked at how we're assessing risk and thought about those opportunities. So I want to talk to you now about 2 examples of studies where I did that. The first study was where I looked at risk assessment that New Zealand police were doing for family violence cases. So the New Zealand police have 2 different risk assessment instruments that they use for people experiencing family violence. The first one is called the Static Assessment of Family Violence Recidivism, or SAFER is what I'm going to refer to it as. And that's an instrument that is basically measures the criminal history of the person who's been identified as the aggressor in a given case. So it looks at that person and goes, okay, you know, how many of these things have you had in the past? So it might be to do with previous prison sentences or offences, you know, number of family violence offences, things like that. And based on those characteristics, it automatically generates a score, low, medium or high, that police have on a phone at when they attend at the scene, so they know what that SAFER score is. On the other hand, the DIRA, as I call it, the Dynamic Risk Assessment, is something that police complete at the scene. So that's not completed from archival, you know, data they have on file. That's completed in the moment by asking questions of the victim when they're actually at the scene responding. So the number of questions depends on the situation. So in every case, there will be 10 questions. If it involves intimate partners, there will be a further 2 questions. And if children are involved, there will be a further 4 questions. So it could have anywhere between 10 and 16 questions. And these questions relate to the current circumstances of the family. So it might be things like, is the aggressor experiencing any, you know, mental health problems? Is there something currently distressing them or things like that? It will also ask things to do with, other stresses and whether they're breaching conditions, things like that. So things that have been identified as risk factors. So that assessment is dynamic in that it's trying to capture that current circumstance. So we've got one that's about the history and one that's trying to get at the now. And I was really interested to know how well this dynamic one was working because it was brand new. We've got pretty good evidence about looking at criminal history. It does well to a point. And then obviously there's other things involved. Current circumstances add so much. So in this study, I was really interested to establish the predictive validity of this dynamic assessment because it had never been looked at before, including not before it was rolled out. So to answer this question, we collected police reports for about 2,000 events reported in Waikato and Canterbury in November and December 2018. And once we had reports that were complete, like had no missing information, that left us with about 1,800. What we did next was collect those 2 different risk levels, the low, medium, high for both the SAFER and the DIRA. Then we collected reports for episodes that were reported over the next 3 days, 3 months, and 6 months. And the reason we did that is because if something's dynamic, it should be really good at predicting in the short term, and they use it to inform a 3-day safety plan. So we wanted to know, was it useful for that, but also moving further out, was it useful for kind of medium term, which is where we're really trying to intervene with people. And I looked at another report to police, not another offence, because I think it's about 2/3 of family violence incidents reported to police are not recorded as offences. So if you have 100% of what's reported, 30% will involve an offence and 10% will actually result in an arrest. So if you're only interested in arrest or conviction, you are missing a massive amount of what's reported, which we know is, again, only 23% of what happens. So let's try and get as much as we can, right? The best thing would be to call everyone and ask them, but I did not have money to do that. So instead, I reported what was reported over that time. And finally, we looked at the relationship between those initial risk assessments and what happened next. What did we find? skip off that slide. So basically, starting off with the SAFER. The SAFER did a pretty good job at predicting recurrence. It did a really good job of telling us who wasn't going to have another event. So when we looked at the low risk category, most of them did not have a recurrence reported to police. That's great news. However, when we looked at the moderate and the high risk category, again, a lot of people did not have a recurrence reported to police. So what that's telling us is that it's very risk averse. It's screening in a lot of people that it might not need to. But personally, I actually think that's okay if it's just a first triaging step, if it's doing a good job of telling us who's probably not going to be unsafe. That's okay. We can move forward if we have an assessment that helps us better identify the people who are at risk. And that's what I hoped that the DIRA would do. But unfortunately, the dynamic questions was only marginally better than chance at predicting what would happen next. So, yeah, that's interesting, right? You would think it would be better. There could be some opportunity to improve this tool. It showed the same pattern as the SAFER, where the low-risk people tended to be low risk, but then medium and high. I should say that about 40% of people were high on the SAFER. Like that's a lot of people for high risk. So you can see it's very risk averse, screening people in rather than out. But with the DIRA, you know, has lots of questions for IPV, has lots of questions for when children are present. So for IPV cases, it was better than chance. But for cases that were not intimate partner violence, which remember is about a third of the sample, it wasn't better than chance. So it's doing a really poor job for these other family relationships, which represent a big part of the problem as well. And also, both instruments performed more poorly when the aggressor was a woman, when the aggressor was Māori, and for those non-intimate partner relationships. So they're doing a good job with Pākehā men who are harming their partners, which matches up with that idea of family violence and isn't capturing that kind of more intricate picture that I talked about before. So I think that's really interesting, and I think it's really clear what we can do next to improve this instrument, basically collecting more data and thinking about how it matches people in Aotearoa. The dynamic instrument, I know already that in response to these findings, New Zealand Police have been working on improving it. So that's really, really great and shows the benefits of doing this type of research. Finding, you know, these things are working, these bits aren't, and here's where to go next. I think that's valuable. So I mentioned before that after New Zealand Police respond to an event, there might be some further responses down the line. And that's what I was interested in next. I was interested in the decision-making of the practitioners who respond to people experiencing family violence after that initial police response, because we do put a lot of focus on what police are doing, and I would argue that a lot of the work to be done in this space isn't necessarily work for police. So, in Waikato and Canterbury, this is really dark. In Waikato and Canterbury, every case of family violence that's reported to police is passed on to the integrated safety response for further risk assessment, triaging, and case management. So regardless of what risk level you get on the DIRA and the SAFER, you get passed on. That's actually very unique internationally. In places like the UK, you only go to these multi-agency responses if you're already high risk. So it's a very small proportion of people that get this extra support. And in New Zealand at the moment, everyone's being referred on. So again, massive volume. But I think it's a great opportunity to potentially catch people who we might have missed earlier. So what happens at the integrated safety response is you have a team of representatives. So this includes people from police, Arapotama Corrections, Oranga Tamariki, Ministry for Children, Health, iwi, ACC, other NGOs are represented there, and they meet every day virtually, sometimes twice a day, to discuss cases that have recently been reported to police. So ideally, this meeting would happen within 3 days of the event itself. What they do is they read through the police report of, the description of the event, and they also, before that meeting, will go into their own organisation's database and look up the people involved and say, this person actually has several incidents of falling down the stairs recently. Maybe I should share that information, say, from ACC or health. Or Oranga Tamariki might know that this person has a care history, or they have children in care, for example, or things like that. So what that means is they can come to the table, they can share information, only information that is relevant, not just everything that they have on file, only things that are relevant to keeping them safe. And that hopefully enables them to perform a more complete risk assessment, right? So police do what they do on the scene, and they do their best on the scene. And the idea is that this is an opportunity for organisations to fill in the gaps in that next step. So what they do currently is the representatives around this table, they go through the report, they share their information, and then they kind of shout out into the room what they think are the risk factors present in this case. And there's someone in the room who writes this down. And then they collaboratively agree, don't ask me how, on a risk category, low, moderate, or high. What do they think the risk is for this whānau? So I said before that the safer, about 40% get high risk. For the ISR one, it can be around 6%, maybe to 10%. So it's really small proportion that are high risk. Quite a lot are low risk, and quite a lot, again, are medium risk. So, it's always arguable on whether we're getting that right. I actually think personally that having 5 categories would be better than 3. I think 3 is far too simple. And there's lots of research to support that. But it's also all to do with the resourcing that's available. And the support that high-risk cases require and receive is so intensive that could also play into the proportion that are allocated as high. Just food for thought. So to investigate the predictive validity of these assessments, we again had the same sample, but it's half the sample because I had to spend a year of my life hand coding all those risk factors that they shouted out in the room because they weren't systematically recorded, and they would write things in different ways and all of just as we do. So I spent a very long time hand coding all of these so that we could analyse them. Because as well as knowing how well the overall assessments and categories were doing, we wanted to know if these were even risk factors. Were these things that they were thinking of as risky, were they actually associated with what happened next? So the first step was recording all of that, coding all the risk factors, and then again, collecting reports about what happened next. And this time, because I was interested in a medium-term response, I just took a 6-month time frame instead of that really short time frame, and I looked at whether or not there was another report, so recurrence, and whether or not there was any physical violence. So 2 different measures. And I did that because the integrated safety response is interested in will it happen again, so that's their level of concern, but also how much harm is going to happen. And that's really hard to quantify, but I used physical violence kind of as an indicator for that. And again, finally, I analysed the predictive validity. What did I find? Wow, another telling image. I found that fewer than half of those factors that they were recording and using to inform their judgments were risk factors. So a lot of things that they were considering were things that might well be concerning, but weren't risk factors in the, traditional, very strict definition of it. They weren't associated with what happened next. They could well be useful for informing how to reach whānau or engage with them, which is also important, and I looked at it in a different study that I'm not going to talk about, but if this is about risk assessment, fewer than half of the factors were actually risk factors, and I think that that is important. Regarding the predictive validity, I have that same image from before. So this instrument fell somewhere between Police's SAFER, that did pretty good, and the DIRA, that not so good. So this was somewhere in between there. And you know what? I was pleasantly surprised because when I saw how unstructured these assessments were and that they weren't combining them in a systematic way, they were kind of just consensus agreeing, I was a little bit concerned that, you know, we don't know how this is going to go, right? But actually, not too bad, which is great. It shows that there are merits clearly to professional judgment. Also, they are doing these assessments knowing what the DIRA and SAFER were too, so maybe those played into it. But again, just like the instruments I discussed before, they performed more poorly for non-intimate partner cases, which are a considerable proportion of what's happening, more poorly for women, and also more poorly for Māori. So clearly, there is a lot of work to be done in this space. So I talked a lot about risk assessment. And the thing is, we can criticise these instruments for only predicting so much or being this good or whatever. But human behaviour is inherently difficult to predict, right? Our lives change so rapidly. We do have some degree of free will. And so I believe, and many of my colleagues believe, that there's a ceiling to how much we could predict anyway, right? So if these are doing a good job of improving our decision making, of helping us making better decisions, I don't think perfect is actually realistic. We need to think about user-friendly. One of the problems in my first study was we know that the DIRA is quite tedious to fill out, so many police who are very busy just don't do it. So actually, can we think about how to guide decision-making in ways that are used and helpful and have good predictive validity? I think that those are also important goals. Another thing that is just so important to mention is I've talked about interventions, right? That's the point of the integrated safety response. Even police arriving, that's an intervention. But it's not recorded well. So in these studies, I've said to you, oh, well, it did this well at predicting. But if the thing that you're trying to predict is also the thing you're actively trying to prevent, then not predicting it that well could well mean you've done your job. It could well mean you've predicted it and then prevented it. So that's actually also a potentially good outcome. So that's something I'm trying to work on next, is improving the way that we record what we're doing with families after, so that we can account for that when we're looking at whether our decision making is any good. Because especially with the high risk cases, right, like I said, it does well at screening out the low risk, not so good at telling what's going to happen with high risk. But I know that we're doing more to intervene with high risk cases. So if we've got lots of high risk cases who don't have things happen in the future, that's good news, right? But I really want to know if that's actually what's happening or if I'm just being optimistic. So clearly there's more work to be done in this space. But going back to the slide that I showed you before with all the numbers, massive volume of reports, massive volume, and it's only 23% of what's happening. So everything I've talked to you about today is in the context of what we're doing with about a quarter of people experiencing what's going on, right? So people like me can sit in their offices and whittle away on optimizing the way we make our decisions. But if we aren't getting better at preventing this harm from occurring in the first place, then we're actually not going to affect the problem that much, right? So, of course, we want to do better at responding. We want to be more inclusive. We want to do better for our Māori whānau, for our aggressors who are women, for our people who are experiencing non-intimate partner violence, and the people who are experiencing this in general, right? We want to be doing better. But also, I think a big part of that is getting back down to these root causes. So these things that we're identifying and as risk factors and measuring, we should be trying to reduce those in our communities before we get these things that are reported or not reported. So hopefully we can do some more work in that space as well. And I know that the government have recently embarked on a new strategy for family and sexual violence called Te Arere Kura. And these are just the themes that came out of their most recent hui about that strategy. So this is interesting, pulling these things together, because we know a lot of sexual violence obviously it's part of family violence and they overlap to a great degree. And many of the challenges and things that need to happen in these spaces are very similar. But the reason I included this slide is because it pretty closely mirrors the conclusions in the papers that I've been writing about what we need to do in this space. So many of the things to do with addressing inequities, leadership from communities and really involving them, and a shared pathway forward, that's actually mirrored in all aspects of this space, right? So I'm going to keep going on trying to improve responses, but I'm also hopefully going to be part of work thinking about preventing in the first place. So that's everything from me. Thanks for having me. If you have questions, and these are QR codes for the 2 studies that I just shared with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, April Jolliffe-Simpson. Let's give her a round of applause before we do questions. April, thank you. You're very articulate and clearly very passionate, and it's fantastic to have you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions from the floor for April? Yes, sir. Can you stand, please, and project your voice? Would be great.
Do we want to use this?
Yes, we can throw that, or be careful.
On the rebound. Thank you. April, could you tell us the data collection system that you've used, is that modelled anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, so I just use New Zealand Police's database. So,
Which country?
New Zealand.
Yes, which? Is it modelled on Finland or the Scandinavian group?
So I recorded just everything that was reported to police. So they just, I had access to theirs. And this is something that we do in other countries, looking at what's reported. And it really just relies on the trust and good relationship that we have with them. So they do it in lots of countries. And this type of research has been done in many countries. What was unique about my work is that often this work is done with people in prison, and it's done just looking at offences, say. So you'll have an assessment and then you'll look, did someone go to prison in a year or 2 years? What was unique in this sense was we were looking at what's reported. We were getting at a bigger proportion of what's going on. So it's been done everywhere, but the difference is trying to look at a lower threshold of harm, not just what's ending up in the correctional system.
What I'm interested in is to benchmark it against Finland. Where did we rank on the world scene?
In
Otherwise,
terms,
we're winking in the dark and reinventing the wheel. This goes
I
back
hear
many
you,
years
yeah.
to the 1960s when this university came into existence with James and Ritchie's, who did a lot of work on this and
absolutely.
wrote some really good provocative things at the New Zealand Society.
For
Looking
sure.
back to rugby, for example.
Yes, yeah.
So I would like to benchmark it so we know where we are. Otherwise,
Yeah, I hear you. So the question is, where are we in terms of the problem or in terms of the assessment instruments? Is that what you're asking? Like how well the instruments are doing, or how much is going on?
yes, so if you've modelled that methodology, the system
Oh, yeah.
on another country, which ones? I mean, our UK is not a good example for me. But if
Yeah.
you're talking about Finland, Switzerland, or the Scandinavian group per se, who, as I understand it, have a far, far better situation than we do.
Yes.
So I want to see...
Maybe not. So yes, I hear you. So these instruments are bespoke, based on instruments in the US, in Canada, in the UK, in Europe. There's one in Spain. It's global. So there are some really well-known ones. In fact, we used to use one called the ODARA, which was used in Canada. We used that here for many years. And then we found that it wasn't quite meeting the standards that New Zealand Police had. And so based on that, they decided to develop their own new one. So that's why we have these ones. So it is bespoke based on our context, but it's using the method, this way of pulling together information and using that to guide decisions is very well established. On the international stage, New Zealand Police are regarded quite highly in this space for their efforts, especially the idea of using one for criminal history and one to get at what's happening now, because a lot of people just rely on criminal history, which misses a big part of the picture. So Did that answer the question?
Thank you, April.
I'm interested in cultural change.
Yes.
So we'll give somebody else an opportunity. Is that okay? You can speak to April after. Anybody else an opportunity to ask a question? Yes, please, ma'am.
I would like, I don't think I need it.
Okay.
I would like to ask you, of
Yeah.
the work that you have doing, how much is being implemented and making it better for results? That's my first question. And the second one is, what part does mental health play in domestic violence between a parent and a child? I can tell you of a woman who really had a problem, and they were told the only way you'll get support is if the police are called in, which ultimately they were, and then the services were able to implement. How far behind are we in mental health?
Oh.
That's got 3 questions.
Yes, I will do my best to work through those. So the first question was about the extent to which things have been implemented. So the first study I talked about, the one on the left, New Zealand Police were really receptive to. I've presented it multiple times to different parts of police, and they, after my study was published, they commissioned a further review into their dynamic assessment instrument, which backed up what I said. It looked at more data and different outcomes and found much the same picture. And now they're working on how to improve that instrument. Part of that might be changing what questions they're asking. It might be reducing the number of questions they're asking. So lots of work being done in that space. I also have relationships with the Integrated Safety Response, which is the second paper I talked about. And in that space, I'm actually meeting with them soon, actually, to talk with them more. It's really quite unique internationally, the relationships that we have at Te Puna Haumāru, the Institute for Security and Crime Science, with organisations in the community, in that they are part of the research, they hear the findings, and they can use that moving forward. So we don't just extract their data and publish over here and never speak with them again. They are involved and fed back to. And I'm doing a new study with them now also, which is looking at their perspectives of the challenges in service delivery, like what you mentioned before. So obviously we always want to implement more, but I think as far as research goes, this has been going quite well. The second question you had was about mental health. I think that it is part of the problem, and in my opinion, part of the problem is that it's so difficult to get mental health services that you do have to call police, because who else is on call 24/7? And ambulances don't come. So we end up with a lot of people receiving responses from police that perhaps might be better served by other services. So yes, I think you're correct. I don't think that we can use mental health issues to explain family violence, because I think that it happens for many reasons, and many people are not mentally ill and many people are mentally ill, and it's nothing to do with the family violence. But I do think we have a problem whereby access to mental health services is really lacking. So the problems might overlap, but I do think they're different problems that are both really important and need to be better served.
Thank you, April. Yes, ma'am, right over there. Thank you.
Just going to say that the ISL model you've spoken about has potential to do really well and has done some good things. But those are two areas in Aotearoa that have those models and the funding attached to those models. Nowhere else. Then you can and if we're talking about Tauranga, which is where we all live, we don't have anything like that service.
Yeah.
I've been on the ground working in family violence for over 10 years. Some of my colleagues that are sitting here with me are actually working with the police on a daily basis. We have nowhere to put those high-risk families. They don't need to work anywhere else.
Yeah.
So the model's fantastic. The reality is a whole different other story.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I was going to talk about, the first model, frontline police, and filling in the form 60 questions. Of course, that's really kind of subjective.
Oh, yeah.
Even if they're asking those questions, we have victims who are too scared key.
Absolutely.
People of power and control and fear and a very real concern about retribution and sympathy.
Absolutely.
So those questions, even if they're asked by police, are not necessarily, don't necessarily have
Yeah.
kind of relationship with ongoing risk, actually.
I agree with you 100%. So I should have addressed that. The integrated safety response is quite unique. We have responses like Whangaia in Auckland, but again, they're not well resourced, and I don't think there's an excuse for that. We clearly need this everywhere in the country to support our organisations who are responding in this space. And I agree with you about the dynamic questions. Coming away from this research, so when I went into it, I thought, we could just have one assessment that could be used for every family and police could just ask it and that would solve everything. That's what I thought. And then 4 years later, I believe that we could have an initial assessment that police use, like that static one that's on criminal history. And then once we get a better grip on what things are actually risk factors for the different contexts that people are experiencing, so the overlapping forms of harm, the different whānau contexts, that could be a specialised assessment that our practitioners are doing to refine our knowledge. Because I agree with you, we know that in that moment people are having, potentially the worst day of their lives. This is maybe not a good time to collect information from those people, right? Like, sure, we want to do it, but I agree with you that practitioners, especially those who have a pre-existing relationship with that person, probably have a much better job of evaluating their safety. So I think that if we had the funding and the will to support things like ISR in other parts of the country, that could be a space to empower our practitioners to actually do those assessments. So I agree with you completely.
Government put those things as a pilot with the idea of rolling it out across the country.
Yeah.
It cost so much money, they said actually no more.
Yes, and I'm thankful that they're still going, but it is a big disparity to have things this unified in some communities and then not in other communities. Hopefully if we can do research showing how effective it is or what's going well, that could add support for that argument of providing it in other communities too. I actually recently was involved with a police officer in the Bay of Plenty who was launching a proceeds of crime funding application to hire family violence specialists for this region who would pull that information together. But again, that's a big rigmarole to apply for funding for a limited time to hire 2 or 3 people. So it's one of the largest barriers in this space is funding, and that's already coming out of the next study that we're doing.
Thank you, April, and thank you for that insight on the ground here in Tauranga and for your service, ma'am, for you and your colleagues here today. Final question, anybody else? Yes, please, sir. Do you want to stand, please? Thank you.
Just a question, when you talked about those tools, not serving women and mothers, got any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. I do. So part of this actually links back to the first question, which was about where were these models based on? And they are based on overseas. They're based on overseas research and understandings of what risk factors are, of what family violence is, of who aggressors are. And when the knowledge base we have for responding to this problem is based on studying white men in prison in North America, it's not surprising that when we use those ideas to inform how we do things here, that it falls short for many people in our community. I think that, like I said before, some kind of baseline criminal history thing for that immediate response and then a more tailored response at the next step where we look at risk factors that are relevant for, say, aggressors who are women, aggressors who are Māori, whānau who are Māori. That, to me, is maybe how we should be moving forward, because we all like something unified and neat, but when you're basing that off part of the population, it's not going to work. We might like it to. And the other thing is, when we create risk assessment instruments, usually we're doing it on data that we have. So I looked at data that New Zealand Police held, and We know that there are biases in the system as it works at the moment. We know that. It might be hard to pinpoint, but we know that they're there. So when you create these instruments, say you're using 10 years worth of data and you're trying really hard to be unbiased, you're still creating an instrument based on that. You're looking at what happens and what happens next based on a system that we feel is biased. So then we create an instrument which on the surface might look very, very objective, but the data used to create it still has those biases in it. So there's still a lot more work to be done in this space to find different ways of measuring the problem more fairly so that we can create instruments that are measuring the outcomes more fairly. Because, for example, if we conceptualize family violence as only something that men do against their wives, then, and that's what we tell society, is that not then what society will report to us as happening? And when other things are happening, it might be treated differently or dealt as a family matter or overlooked or things like that. So it's all of these kind of frameworks that we import from overseas or from history kind of then shape what it is that we're recording and then what we use to predict the future. So these are really difficult problems to untangle, but I think just taking a step back and trying to not do everything at once and just do little bits well is the way to better serve everyone in our community. Kia ora.
April, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause please for April.